Okay, we're
Yes.
going to start a minute early. We are very good. So welcome everybody to the Lethbridge Historical Society's tour of Mountain View Cemetery. The purpose tonight is we've been doing a lot of research since the Vice, Virtue, and Lust book came out from the Lethbridge Historical Society, a decade ago, I believe, at least. And so this is some news stories of Mountain View Cemetery that we're going to be doing tonight. As always, if you are a Lethbridge Historical Society member and you make a comment, we will put your name into a draw for a gift certificate that will be coming later here, probably in September, when we'll be making all of those draws. Of course, anyone, please feel free to make comments, ask questions. I have certain headstones that we will be going to. We'll be walking through basically from block 4 through block 13 and then back around, if that helps you understand where we're going in the cemetery. But if there's something you have questions about, please ask, and I will try to answer them either during the tour live or later when I get home and get back to the research files. So we have Genesis Heavy Oriole behind the camera. Carol McGough from the Historical Society is here with us as well to sort of help make sure we get the tour done. So we are standing here outside Mountain View Cemetery. When you look at Mountain View Cemetery, today you look at it as one cemetery, but there's actually a few different cemeteries that are all interlinked. The oldest portion is actually from 1901, and it's the Anglican Cemetery. And when we get to block 1, we'll be in that old part of the Anglican Cemetery. When we cross to block A later on in the tour, that is the B.C. Moore part of the cemetery, bought by the city. He started it in 1905, the city purchased it in 1909. There's also another part of the public cemetery here, and then if we got down to, we won't tonight, but if we get down to the west end, there is the Hebrew cemetery, the Jewish cemetery there as well. And so there are portions now that have all sort of been combined into one cemetery, but the cemetery has quite a bit of different history. And as we go through, if you're watching the headstones, you can kind of get a sense if we're in an older or a newer area of the cemetery. When we get into the old parts, you'll see a lot of sandstone, a lot of marble headstones. When we're in the newer areas, you'll see a lot more of the granite headstones. So kind of take a look at that. We're starting right now beside the Eternal Flame because we're going to start in block 4. Block 4 is one of the 4 fields of honor in Mountain View Cemetery, so we'll start there, and then we're going to head over into block 3 and let that sort of go throughout parts of the cemetery. So we're going to head now to George Stranglingwolf's grave, and we'll start there on our tour today. So when you're in a field of honor, the nice thing is everybody is buried by the date they died. So if you know the year someone died, it makes it a lot easier in the field of honor. In other parts of the cemetery, you'll notice we'll be looking around a bit more for headstones because while people tend to be buried with family members, they're not always in a logical place. So here we have buried George Stranglingwolf, who was a private in the First World War. He enlisted on the 26th of June 1916, and he was Guinea from the Blood Reserve. When he enlisted, he actually modified his uniform while at Camp Sarcee up by Calgary, replete with elk teeth, earrings, and necklace, which did get him in a bit of trouble. When he was serving overseas, he was gassed at Lens in 1917 and sent home. Mike Mountainhorse shared a story about him in his writings and said, during the dark days of 1917, when the Germans were having things pretty much their own way, George Stranglingwolf made an offering of a small portion of his skin, praying, "Help me, son, to survive this terrible war, that I may meet my relatives again. With this request, I offer you my body as food," and then buried a piece of his flesh cut from near his knee. When he was back in southern Alberta, he later went back to work as a scout for the mounted police, serving here in southern Alberta. And he died in 1947 and is buried here in the field of honor. We're going to move just a row or two over and find the headstone of a man who was killed in 1948. So we're going to just move this way. And you'll notice when we walk through, we try to walk between the headstones as we can. Genesis and I are going to lead. So we're going to try to make sure that we 3 CPR employees, all of whom were veterans. A flood caused a washout and the locomotive and 10 freight cars plunged over the washout on Rock Creek. Killed in the accident were Edward Lewis James, Gordon Herbert Cripps, and William Martin Dommett. Dommett was a veteran of the First World War. Born in England, he came with his family to Saskatoon in 1906 and moved here to Lethbridge in 1917. When in Lethbridge, he went to work for the CPR, and except for his time away during the First World War, he worked entirely for his entire career with the CPR. Following his death in the train accident in 1948, he was survived by his spouse. He is buried here in the Field of Honor. One of the reasons, you'll notice as you walk through that there are some of the military headstones that are outside of the Field of Honor, or there are some people that you know are veterans who are outside the Field of Honor. And one of the reasons is it was difficult to be buried with your spouse in a Field of Honor. It was for the veteran. Now they actually allow the cremains of a spouse in the Field of Honor as well. So if you notice on some, you'll see a small plaque for the spouse sometimes. So that means the cremated remains of the spouse are buried there as well. And that way you can be buried in the Field of Honor and still have your spouse with you as well. But in the old days that wasn't permitted. So we're going to move just another block over and find where Charles Chow Leong or Charles Chow is buried. So we're going to head down here to the red headstone. His photograph is on the headstone here. Turn it that way. Charles Chow was born here in Lethbridge on 27th June 1922 to Ling and May Chow. He attended the White School, which was just outside of Lethbridge, and then LCI. And he worked at the Ritz Cafe prior to enlisting in the military in 1942. Was sent overseas to Britain in 1944 and almost immediately posted to India, where he served until 1945. Following his time in India, he was then posted to Brussels as part of the occupation forces in Europe, and after the war went to work for the Chinese National Airline, but rejoined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1951. After he rejoined the RCAF in 1951, he was killed during an accident in Manitoba in 1952. Charles Chow was the first Chinese Canadian to enlist for pilot training in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Following his death in the accident in 1952, he was survived by his widow Marge and daughter Carol and a large extended family here in southern Alberta. We could continue on. There's a lot of amazing stories here in the Field of Honor, but we're going to head to Block 3, which is part of the Anglican Cemetery, and we're going to go see if we can find Mr. Rupert. The difficulty is when you only see names written. I hope I'm saying some of them correctly. Shared, and then the footstones tell you exactly who's buried where. So it's always good when you're standing in a cemetery, if there's a footstone and you're on the east side of it, you tend to know you're in a spot where nobody's buried. So here we find Major Theodore Charles Rubler. One of the things about headstones is sometimes they don't provide us a lot of information. His is nice because it does have quite a bit of detail on it. You'll notice at the top it says RNWMP, Royal Northwest Mounted Police, Boer War and Great War. So, meaning of course that he served as a mounted police officer, served in the South African War, and served in the First World War. Rubber was born in Birmingham, England in 1876 and came to Canada in 1885. As he moved to Canada, he moved first to Toronto and then to Manitoba in 1889. Now, he's born in 1876, he gets to Manitoba in 1889, which means he's about 13 years old. And when he got there, he made his own living at trapping and hunting at 13 years old. with the group of mounted police officers who enlisted and were sent to South Africa and served during the South African War. While he was over there, he met a young war correspondent named Winston Churchill and was actually escorted Churchill from Pretoria during his escape to safety after the event. When he got back to southern Alberta, he rejoined the mounted police in Calgary in 1901. And while in Calgary in 1901, he served as part of the escort for the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George V and Queen Mary, while they were visiting Banff. So in his world, he got to meet Winston Churchill long before Churchill ever became Prime Minister, and then he met the future King and Queen of England as well. So he did get to rub some elbows with some relatively famous people. After his time serving in Calgary, he was then sent to Olds and Red Deer. In 1912, he switched career. This is not on his headstone, but in 1912, he switched from the mounted police into the customs. 1916, he went overseas as the second in command of the Edmonton Highlanders and rejoined the Customs Department after the war. In 1929, he is sent to Lethbridge as part of the Customs detail and works as the appraiser here at the Customs Department, which means he worked out of the old post office building, the old federal building, as the appraiser for Customs. Retired from Customs Department in 1941, still living here in Lethbridge, and passed away after a very short retirement, only 1 year, in 1942. And his wife Bessie is buried here with him. A very interesting and long career, and I'm glad to see that there's some detail on his headstone. Let me introduce you to somebody who has no details on his headstone, but you might recognize the name. So here we have W.D.L. Hardy, William Duncan Livingston Hardy, who many of you may know is one of my favorite people in Lethbridge history. This is Mayor Hardy. There are, of course, several mayors buried in Mountain View Cemetery. Not one mayor buried in the cemetery has mayor on their headstone. So unless you actually know that it's a Lethbridge mayor, you would not recognize him. Hardy, of course, was the mine manager, also managed the government elevator, and was mayor from 1913 till 1927, and was the only mayor who served under the commission form of government. So when we had 3 commissioners, he was the mayor during that. And the commission form of government was a rather interesting time when they were elected for 3 years, and you directly elected your mayor every 3 years, and it basically ran like a dictatorship, very small council, and was brought in quite deliberately following the 1912 Dry Farm Congress, when Lethbridge went into a major debt in 1912. We built Henderson Lake, we built the exhibition, we did paving, we built sidewalks, we built the sewer system, we built the streetcar system, and went into a major debt during the recession of First World War, 1920s, and didn't really get out of debt until about 1928. And so his job was to come in and cut things and make the city economical. I came across, so he's elected to this he's elected mayor in 1913. They bring in the commission form of government in January 1914, and already by June 1914 there's a petition trying to recall him. So you either loved him or you hated him. He certainly was a divisive personality, and he also was a psychic from everything I've read. If you had gone to City Hall, he might have offered to read your tarot cards. So an all-around interesting character, Mayor Hardy, and it is very sad that none of that's on his headstone. So, but the next person doesn't even have a headstone. We're going to have to see if we can find where she's buried. I would love to give her a headstone, and when you find out who it is, you'll know why. buried in this empty spot is Frances Wright, Fanny Wright, and Minnie White. Now, don't let me telling you three names confuse you, because there's only one woman buried here. She used a lot of pseudonyms, and those are the three I found. Maybe there's more. In Lethbridge, Fanny Wright, Frances Wright, Minnie White was in Lethbridge by at least 1911. By that time, she was 30 years old, a widow, and was working as a prostitute in Violet Keene's house. She, within 3 years, went from working for Violet Keene to having her own home, and by 1914 was working as a madam in Lethbridge with a house on 3rd Avenue near 1st Street South, so out on the point. She will continue working as a madam in Lethbridge for the next several decades, and by the mid-1930s she is relocated to 322 4th Street South. I've been able to piece together some information on her from various articles. She was often in court for liquor infractions. She, of course, had charges of running a bawdy house or a house of ill repute. She also is in the records a lot for donations she made to the war effort and to several causes. So you see quite a bit of notice on her. She passes away in 1939, and in 1940 there is a notice about her estate, and that's one of the places we see all three names listed, linking her all to one woman. So she did her work in Lethbridge under the name Minnie White, Minnie Wright and Minnie White. After her death, some of her property was sold off, and one thing that was up for sale was her 5-acre acreage and house located on the southeast outskirts of Lethbridge. So she had the brothel right downtown, but she also had a private residence that she could go to when she wanted to escape. And her private residence, we think, and if you live here, you can contact me because we think this is true, we're trying to prove it, was still standing at 2122 16th Avenue South. And that was her private residence that was separate from her working life. And so that may well be the only house in Lethbridge that we can definitively link to a madam in Lethbridge history. At least one of the madams from the early part of Lethbridge history. It wasn't a brothel, but it was her private residence. She is buried here, and I know I've talked to many of you. One of the things I'd love to do, there's quite a few people buried in this cemetery that have unmarked graves, and if you want at some point to create a fund to purchase some of these, and there's various people in here. She is one of the madams buried here, unmarked. Mildred Fleming is another madam buried in the cemetery, but she actually has a headstone. Doesn't have anything else but her name, no dates, nothing like that, but there is another madam buried in Lethbridge Cemetery as well. Alright, we're going to move a little bit further over towards the east and go find William Meldrum, who has quite a different story to tell. He actually has a street named after him, though, of course, it's no longer named after him. It has a number now. And I don't know if anybody knows they live on Meldrum Street or Meldrum Avenue. Do we have any comments or questions? Have you noticed anybody asking anything that we can answer as we walk?
The wind is bad.
The wind is bad.
Yeah, so just hold it close.
Okay, I don't notice the wind out here, but yes.
Yeah.
All right. I got notes for myself that I'm east of the tree.
I want to face. Okay. The sun's just against you.
Okay. Meldrum. East of the tree, short gray one. I've got to be closer. I don't know how you guys mark where you need to. Oh, must be just up there. That's okay, we'll just talk about it here.
Okay.
So if you think you live on Meldrum Street, which is named after William Meldrum, who's buried just up over there, you live in Hardyville, because Meldrum Street is one of the original names of streets in Hardyville, or Georgetown it was originally plotted out as. And William Meldrum was actually the surveyor who helped to lay out the streets of the original Georgetown plot. And for that work, Georgetown has a street named after him. He was also the surveyor for the Galt 6 mine and lived in Hardyville up until the 1930s. And while in Hardyville, worked as the trustee and secretary-treasurer of the Hardyville School District. When the Hardyville mine closed down, he moved into town and lived in what's now the Victoria Park neighborhood and is buried just over here. So we are right now in section 3. We're going to walk over into section 7 and go find a woman who, with her sister, ran an ice cream parlor back before the First World War. You know, people have trouble with the sound. They were invited to actually come. Like, they could be here.
Live.
Yeah.
Feel the
in
wind.
person. So one of the fun things about the cemetery is seeing how it's changed. So we're coming, oh, there's a baby. Not really too much baby now, but one of the things is here's an old road. So you can imagine the small cars would have been a nice road to go down, but now it's been grassed over. And we actually have a plot in the cemetery called Plot DR, and it's actually plot driveway. So they took one of the old roads, and when they got too full, they started burying people in the old driveway. This one is still not, as far as we know, nobody's buried here. So we can walk down this old road quite comfortably and not worry that we're standing on anybody's grave.
Sounds better when you hold it close to it.
Okay.
And someone's here from Winnipeg.
Oh, well then they couldn't
Virtually,
come in person.
and they couldn't come in
I
person.
understand that entirely. We have a tree down here. So we're going to go find Minnie Beaton Leaves.
Someone's listening from Vancouver Island.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
So Winnipeg is staying up later than Vancouver Island. So Winnipeg would be already late in the evening. All right.
Medicine Hat as well.
Well, welcome everybody. I need to get to some of the Medicine Hat Cemetery. We've got some cool stuff here. The other thing, if I think about heads or graves, I should plan the tour always going east to west. We're going west to east because what do you have? All the backward headstones to you as you're trying to track people down. So if you actually do cemetery tours, you know that I'm doing this backwards. I love this tree. I've taken some pictures of it. You see how all the butterflies somebody took the time to put in? It's been like that like since the spring at least. I don't know how long it's been. Almost there. Just past the May family. That's Lennox. We're right here at the Great Redwoods. I like it that nobody moved when they were exactly where they were last time I was out there. So you can tell we're in a newer part, not really new, 1980s, 1950s headstones here, but you can see that the granite headstones. So here we have Mary Minnie Beaton Leaves, and she and her sister Margaret Beaton operated the Empire Ice Cream Parlor and the Empire Confectionery right around the time of the First World War, before the two sisters both married. One of the books we're working on at the Lethbridge Historical Society is a book on entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs of Lethbridge history. So we have been trying to find biographies of and information on every woman who owned a business in Lethbridge prior to 1944. At some point we'd like to go from 1944 on, but we've stuck now till in the 1940s and have found way more than you might imagine. Right now we have about 200 names, and this is women who owned stores, but also private schools and music teachers and an osteopath and a dentist and etc. etc. And it's interesting because when you read a quick history of Lethbridge or almost any community, it really sounds like all the business owners were men. But when you actually get down to it and you look at the service industries, it's fascinating how many of those were operated by women. In some cases before they got married, some cases after their husbands passed away, in some cases they never married, or in some cases they ran it even after they were married, and it's been quite fascinating to try to find them. And we're going to move over now and find another businesswoman just across the way. Watch out for the roots. Alright, so we're leaving block 4 and we're heading into leaving block 7 and we're heading into block 8. We got to go down to the end here and find Laura Lucas. All right, Carol, why are the headstones all facing east?
That I don't know.
Genesis, any idea?
Sunrise?
Yeah, literally if you sat laid in a grave, don't do it, don't lay on somebody's grave, and you sat up, you'd be facing east, you'd be facing the rising sun, and your back would be to the setting sun. The concept is, right, birth and death, life and death. So Laura Lucas is right here. short time, just a couple of years. Laura Lucas was involved with businesses for a very long time. She was born in Pine City, Washington, and came to Canada in 1916, settling first in Medicine Hat. In 1925, she moved to Lethbridge and established a millinery business, so making hats, on 13th Street North. And she called her business the Popular Hat Shop, which I think is a very nice name. She later operated a ladies' wear store on 6th Street South and was manager of the Imperial Ladies' Wear store on 4th Avenue South prior to her retirement in 1949 because of poor health. She was predeceased by her husband James, and in 1935 Laura Lucas was one of the founding members of the Quota Club, which was a women's club where they would have speakers in, etc. And it was about inspiring women and encouraging women to learn and do more. And it's interesting, I walked through this area here, and there's some, we won't get to all of them, but Mildred Fleming is over in this area. We also have Edith Kirk, an artist and art teacher in this area. We have the editor of the women's page in the Herald is buried here. You walk through this area and there's really a who's who of women who were working and doing jobs in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So again, even though they're often written out of the history books, it's incredible how many stories are to be found if you go looking through this area. We're now going to head though to, okay, we're in block 8 here, and we're going to just move up a little bit and see if we can find Sloan. So, we're looking for a feisty Scot. Actually, just trying to think here. It should be this direction. But let's go see if we can find him. Yeah, the black headstone that actually says feisty Scot on it. Block 8? Yeah, okay, here we go. Oh, sorry, I'll look at the lot. Sorry guys, I'm looking for a marker. There's Edith Kirk right there. Alright, somehow I went from 9 to 12 and I need 6. So I'm going the wrong direction. Sorry. You can tell I'm on tours. On names I don't do all the time. His headstone's worth finding.
This is 6, I think.
Yeah, and this is pre-mains here. So, where did he go? Yeah, this is 8A. It's too far. Alright, we'll just go down this way. There's no more I want to show you anymore. I used to go walk around this place almost blindfolded. This is why I need to do tours every day now. Mary Mountain Horse is buried right there. If not, we will just tell his story. on me here. Sorry about that. On his headstone, though, it says a feisty Scot. When I tell you his story, you'll understand why. He is one of our more interesting labor leaders. So, James Sloan was a labor leader. He was the national president for decades of the Mine Workers Union of Canada, which was quite a radical union. Most people will think about the United Mine Workers of America, but there was a splinter union that was a little more radical during the 20s and 30s. He came to southern Alberta in 1918 and worked at Colehurst and Hardyville mines, and then became the union president, traveled extensively throughout Canada, and became well known in mining circles over the 18 years he was union president. He was born in Scotland and moved to Saskatchewan in 1907, where he farmed until coming here in 1918. In the 1930s, he moved to Penticton, but came back to Lethbridge in the late 1940s and passed away here in our community. In April 1930, the unemployed in Lethbridge, 1930, beginning of the Great Depression, staged an orderly protest and ended up at City Hall before Mayor Barrowman. Of course, Sloan was part of the spokes group for the group. He drew the mayor's attention to the deplorable conditions in the Schwartz rooming house, where men were herded 16 to a room, having to pay 25 cents for a bed, which meant that every time the owner was making $4. He also challenged those in Lethbridge who were saying that there was no unemployment and said, look around. That was sort of the beginning of some of his work during the Great Depression. In 1931, he was one of the organizers behind the Estevan strike or Estevan riot, depending on your perspective. On Black Tuesday, the 29th of September 1931, miners and their families paraded through Estevan to draw attention to their plight from the mines not far from Estevan. During that parade, they were confronted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP opened fire on the parade and 3 people were killed. Other strikers were wounded and then arrested. Sloan was not arrested on that day, but an arrest warrant was sent out for him, and he was blamed for a lot of the unrest. As I said, an arrest warrant went out, but he managed to not go to prison and was still continued in labor circles. In 1932, he was involved with strikes and unrest in Bellevue. 1934, we have a quote from him calling Bennett's relief camps slave camps, but things, as I said, were getting a little bit more tricky for him in southern Alberta. He moved to Penticton for several years, went into semi-retirement, and then came back to Lethbridge until his passing. So it's interesting how many labor leaders are also buried here in the cemetery, including, as I said, James Sloan, who is really here somewhere. I just didn't find him tonight, but I know he's here. I don't think he got up and left. Do you guys think he did?
Well, he is, he has the reputation for it.
For unrest, yeah. I know where his house is, we're on the north side. All right, we're going to go to block 11. We have a bit of a walk right here. As we walk, this is your chance to ask any questions you might have again. You know, if I don't know the answers, I do just make them up. So the other way they extended the cemetery, if you think back, let's say 20 years ago, I don't think it was that long, the fence was actually right beside the trees, and they moved the fence out so that they had extra space. And so they did what they could to extend the life of this cemetery, though last I heard talking to staff here, you can't purchase any more graves in Mountain View. They're all have been purchased. So the cemetery is completely in use, or yeah, not everybody's buried yet, but its graves are all accounted for. So, and if you haven't been up to Royalview, the new cemetery on the far north, it's filling up pretty quickly as well. Not that, I mean, that one's supposed to be in use for 100 years. It's not full in any sense. We're going to head down here in block 11. We're going to look for Dr. Bryant. See if we can find him. So him at a 9:10, and away down there. So you can always tell when you're in a Japanese section, especially right after July, when there's Obon and Obonadori. A lot of the families come out and they clean the graves and they put flowers on. So we're about a month too late to see the really beautiful flowers, but it's incredible when you walk through the Japanese sections after the event. And I We don't know how many deer are in this cemetery, but there are a lot of them, and they really just feel they own the place. And they probably do, actually. So if you're out in Mountain View and you're trying to find people, you want to find the maps like this so that we know we're in 10 and we're heading down now to 11. And they'll tell you, give you the lots, etc. So here's Asil Palmer and his family, who was one of the directors of the research center. And what you'll see now makes it so much easier in the new sections. People are putting family names on the back, which means you can find everything from right and each direction. And they're also, in some cases, listing the children on the back. So if you're doing genealogical research, you actually have all the information you need as you go through. So, we have the address for Dr. Bryans. He's here in block 11, and he's in lot 3. So let's see how effective our map is. So we should be looking for 3. This way. That's 1, 2, and that the tree should be 3. You can find, you should be able to find a cemetery address. And having said that, do you think you found it? We did. Yay! Success.
You've redeemed yourself.
I
Belinda.
have. Yes. I don't know why we couldn't find Mr. Sloan.
Which one is? Okay.
Dr. Bryans.
Do you want to come closer?
Sure. So William Edwards Bryans, and you can see MD. This is Dr. Bryans. Was born in Ontario in 1878. Graduated from the University of Toronto in 1906. Following graduation, he interned for 2 years at the Western Hospital in Toronto, and in 1909 he decided to move west and set up his practice. His first stop out west here was in Carmangay, where he practiced for 9 years. While in Carmangay, he met his wife, Mabel Shoulders, who of course became Mabel Bryans, who was living in Calgary at the time. The Bryans moved to Lethbridge in 1918, and he joined the practice of Doctors Campbell, Roy, and Craig. He remained with the Campbell Clinic until 1956, when illness caused him to retire, and he passed away a year later. In addition to his work at the clinic, Bryans was medical superintendent at the Galt Hospital for 15 years, and was also for a short time surgeon for the Canadian Pacific Railway. So as we move into this section, you can see the headstones here, but if we turn our camera actually towards the east, you'll notice over there that there are no headstones. It is completely an area where people are buried, but that is a section of flat monuments. So it makes it a lot trickier to try to find anybody there because everybody's headstones are on the flat part. The idea there, and again, there's different theories about why flat monuments started to be used, but the idea was that we were starting to want to kind of pretend people didn't die, hide from death, etc. And if you drive past that area, it just looks like a field of grass. So you can forget that you're even passing a cemetery. That's one of the ideas there. The other idea is they thought that the flat monuments would actually make work in the cemetery easier to mow and easier to manage because you could mow right over them. The difficulty is we sometimes have unstable land, and what would often happen, especially I've seen this in the rural cemeteries, is one end would go down and the other end would come up. In some cases they made it more difficult. If you go down to the newest section of the cemetery, what you'll actually find is they put basically a concrete sidewalk down, and then the headstones go on that, and then the mower can just run right along the concrete sidewalk. So it's making it a lot easier to do.
Dr. Bryan was one of the attendees doctor in the 1930s.
There you go. Whenever you get to a doctor, you usually get good stories of, he was the person who was there when I was born, or, somebody knew him. Yeah, the doctors have awesome stories. All right, we're going to go find a general. Now, there are only 2 generals out of Lethbridge, so your chance is 50-50 that you guess which one we're going to go find. Can anybody name the 2 generals?
Stuart.
What's the other one? Stuart's always the easy one.
Yeah.
Both of them are brigadier generals, one from the First World War, which is Stuart, and one from the Second World War, which is Huckville. But Huckville does not get as much mention in our history book. want to get mentioned, you've got to be the first to do something, not the second. So as you can tell, we're on an old road again, which means we can slip across into block 5 quite easily. So as we go this way, we're getting back into some older headstones. Not as old as we will past the tree. So neither one of our generals is buried in a field of honor. Neither one has general on their headstone either. So it's another time where you have to actually know who you're trying to find in order to find the generals. Keep your eyes open. It'll be after we find General Stewart, but Agnes Davidson is buried out in this area. We're not far from Susie Bodden from Fleetwood Bodden. So if you know your schools, you'll start recognizing some names as we go along as well. So we're just coming up on our left. There is General Stewart. And he's buried with his 2 wives. Not at the same time. His first wife passed away relatively young and he remarried. General Stewart, an interesting career development. So when he started out, he came west from Ontario first as a teacher, went up to the Edmonton area as a teacher, discovered he did not like teaching and decided to go back to school to become a dentist. If you look at his record, it took quite a bit of time for him to get his dental education, and that's because he took a break in the middle to enlist as a trooper in the South African War, so he served in the Boer War. Following that, he returned and finished his dental degree, and then he was looking for a place to practice. Now, one of his best childhood friends was a man named Robert Chesney McClure, who was a dentist and had come out to Lethbridge. And McClure convinced Stewart to come to Lethbridge as well. So he came out here and he joined them. The 2 men were such good friends that if you look at the name of Stewart's first wife, it's Jean McClure. So he actually married his best friend's sister, and McClure married Stewart's sister. So brother and sister married brother and sister. And then what they did, the 2 families, on 8th Street South, they built houses across the road from each other. General Stewart's house still stands. The McClure family's house was knocked down when they expanded the YWCA, when that building was built there on the corner of 6th Avenue and 8th Street. So he has now been a teacher, a dentist, and a soldier. And he decides to then go into politics and becomes a MLA, so a member of the Legislative Assembly. But he is also given a promotion during this time. They approach him in 1907 to see if he will run an artillery battery here in Lethbridge. One of the things that Lethbridge had was good horses, because artillery was then pulled by horses, and men who could handle horses. So in 1908, the most westernmost artillery battery in the British Empire was started here. He was sent off to Royal Military College and was named a major and took over the artillery battery. They practiced until the First World War, shooting duds quite often at Henderson Lake. During the First World War, he had to take leave of absence from the from the legislature and was sent overseas. During the war, he is wounded twice and gets a promotion and becomes home a brigadier general. When he returned to Lethbridge following the war, the story is he attempted to sneak back into Lethbridge. He wanted to come back in the middle of the night so there wasn't any hoopla, but somebody saw him in Medicine Hat, realized the general was coming home, sent a telegram back to Lethbridge and said, General Stewart's coming home. They went around and woke up as many people as they could, and they met him down at the train station to welcome him home. It is said that after they welcomed him, he crossed the street to the Legion, which was then on 1st Avenue South, and signed up for the Great War Veterans Association. Then went back to work with his dental practice and political work. He then left provincial politics and became an MP as well. So this is a man who was a teacher, a dentist, a soldier, an MLA, and an MP. What have you guys done with your lives? Every time I tell his story, I'm like, okay, I've got to do a lot more in my life. But he is buried here in Block 5. And now we're going to move into Block 1, the oldest part of the cemetery. Davidson's the red headstone hiding under the tree there. The red headstones are hard to read at the best of times. At night they get harder to read. When her school was turning 50, they were doing research, and she always seemed to have, okay, we'll be honest, she seemed to have lied about her age. So we had to use her headstone to confirm exactly her age and everything. So we're entering Block 1, the oldest part of Mountain View Cemetery, and you'll probably notice something right away. There's no straight lines here. If you look in the middle and you see the big tree, all of the headstones here go in a circle around the big tree. The reason here was actually very practical. When they had St. Patrick's, the older cemetery on the north side, when you would go out there with a horse and a buggy, they wouldn't turn very sharply, and they realized that they accidentally knocked over some of the headstones. So they thought they'd be smart here. At each corner of the circle, and yes, I know corners, there are no corners on circles, but at each end there is a road in, and then you can kind of go around the circle without knocking anything over. So when you find this area that has the circle, you know you're in Block 1, the oldest part of the cemetery. It's also the place with the oldest headstones. And I'm just going to show you one of my favorites. There's a mayor over here who has the most awesome one. So again, we're on an old road here. You can just kind of wander down. So this is Mayor Rogers, George Rogers. He was the very last mayor the town of Lethbridge ever had, because he was also the first mayor of the city of Lethbridge. So in 1906, when we switched from town to city, he was the mayor. And he died just 3 years later of tuberculosis, which had made him ill for quite a bit of time. But you can see his amazing monument and then his footstone here as well. And the information on it is phenomenal. You know, he has a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Divinity. He had originally worked as a missionary. When he got sick, he quit that church, went back to Ontario, got married, came here with his wife. If you look around, you'll notice his wife is not buried here. That's because a year after his death, his widow ran off with a married Anglican minister. But that's a story for another time. We're not here to do scandal, so we're going to cross over and go find the Field of Honor for the Mounted Sleep.
We should do a scandal only tour.
We could have a lot of fun with scandal only tour. We might have to save that for like an October night or something.
Yeah.
I love this tree. When this cemetery was started in 1901, it's right around the time when Lethbridge got irrigation. And so the trees were not quite as old as the cemetery, but certainly one of the things they did when they finally got irrigation out here was start planting some of the trees. And this tree is phenomenal. There used to be a bench under it, and I used to sit on the bench when I had classes out here. I love that tree. But it's still a beautiful tree. So we're going to go across and go find Mounted Sleep out there. So there's two fields of honor for Mounted Police. One here in Block 1, and then another one called Block 4A, which is close to the Field of Honor where we started. So there's a couple here that are interesting. One of my favorite is Alfred Perry. This cemetery starts in 1901, and so you have Alfred Perry here who died in 1889. So it's just a reminder that sometimes people have monuments even though they're not buried here. Sometimes people are moved. One of the things we know is when they started this cemetery here on the south side of Lethbridge, they actually moved people from the St. Patrick's Cemetery here. So you will quite often find headstones here that predate the cemetery, and quite often it means people were moved. But we're going to focus on the one beside him, Gordon Council, who was killed in action in 1940. So let me just find his story here. So on the 22nd of May 1940, Constable F. Gordon Council of the Lethbridge Detachment was one of a number of RCMP officers who responded to the call for reinforcements to a farmhouse in the Parkland Staveley area. A local man, Charles Hanson, had shot his son and barricaded himself in a neighboring home. After tear gas was used and no sound was heard from Hansen for several hours, counsel and another officer entered the house, working their way upstairs. They thought the tear gas had knocked him out, but unfortunately Hansen was not knocked out, and he shot and killed Constable Counsel. Counsel left behind a wife, Audrey, after his death. And so again, there are so many stories here that the headstones just don't give you any sense. In the field of honor here, we have people who died in line of service, like Perry was killed, was drowned crossing the river in 1889. We have Counsel who was shot. We also have George Harvey over here. He's in the Mounted Police section, but he was Chief of Police for Lethbridge when he passed away. So lots of stories here in this section. We are going to cross now across the road, because I said we would be heading into the BC Moore Cemetery. When we cross the road, we move from the 1901 Anglican Cemetery to the 1905 BC Moore Cemetery. The Moore Cemetery is, there's some frustrating parts here for records. Moore Cemetery is even more frustrating because one of the things that they did in that area there is he would sell like large areas to other undertakers. And so in the records, you might have the undertaker's name, but not necessarily who purchased it. And so it makes it more difficult, though the cemetery office has been doing amazing research to try to update their records here. So they're much better than they were 10 years ago.
Two people saying that they would love to attend a scandal tour, and then someone complimenting you for how much information you know, and saying that you look amazing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've been trying to get the scandals and stuff, and there are some really good ones. The difficulty is if I do a scandal tour, people will start looking for my scandals. No, I don't think I'd have any really good ones yet.
They would have came out by now.
Yes, that's true. I know one of the people who will be watching this tour later is Mr. Carpenter, who lives in England.
Okay.
There's a brick headstone over there that is his family's headstone when the family was here. And his, well, I think it's his great-grandfather, he'll correct me later if I'm wrong, was actually one of the builders who started building the LDS Chapel in 7th Avenue South. Oh, and then passed away. So I said over there was Susie Bodden. Susie Bodden and Mary McClenahan, who are buried here, were the first two women ever elected to the Lethbridge School Board. And it was interesting, sometimes the cemetery provides us amazing information that we don't get anywhere else. In all the records, she was just Mrs. Charles McClenahan or Mrs. McClenahan. And we're like, okay, she needs a name. We couldn't find her name. Of course, in those days, it was always Mrs. Charles, etc. But we were able to confirm with her headstone that it was Mary McClenahan who was one of the first two women trustees in Lethbridge. And I'm going to take you over here and give you my favorite story, because this is another one where the cemetery provides more information than we can find. So we have a obituary from 1907 that says Chas Burkitt, and he's buried over there, bereaved. And it talks about Charles, where he works, where he lives, the clubs he belonged to, and you really get to learn a lot about Charles from the obituary. Unfortunately, it wasn't his obituary, it was his wife's obituary. And when you actually read the obituary and you look at it carefully, it never gave his wife's name. And so one of the things, again, we wanted to give her a name. And so we started to look for her, and I started to research to try to find her. Unfortunately, the obituary spelled the last name wrong, and it said Charles, and his name is actually John Charles, and it had a few other mistakes, so it took a while to track her down. But this is Mrs. Burkitt, Eliza Henrietta Burkitt, who died in 1907. The other thing, and if you've done genealogy and you've read old obituaries, you know that there's hidden sort of clues in them. All it said is she died after a brief illness. Now, I know enough now to know what a brief illness for a woman is, but the headstone actually explains it as well, though in a way you have to figure it out. So we have here Eliza Henrietta Burkitt, wife of J.C. Burkitt, and buried also is Eliza Henrietta Burkitt, daughter. So there is a mother and a baby girl buried here. And a brief illness is usually a clue that you have a mother who died in childbirth. Now, following the rules of the cemetery, and this is for all of Alberta, the only time legally two people can be buried in one grave is a mother and an infant under 1 year old. So the two actually share a headstone or share a grave. And if you look, the baby survived a few months after the mom passed away, but then would have been buried here as well. So it is unbelievable to me how vital the headstones are for information, and which is why anytime you see anything being vandalized, it's like a document has been burned. There's information gone. And as I said, we could continue and continue. We can see over there the oldest field of honor. That's the one with the fence around it, with the maple leaves on it. And we could continue. There's just so many stories. But the sun is starting to go behind the trees there, which means eventually we'll start tripping over headstones, and that's not a good thing. But being back out here, I got to come out here more often. There's so many more stories out here I want to tell. And one of the things that I didn't even get around to, there's about 4 aldermen or city councillors who died while councillors that I was going to share with you on the way. And there's more than that who passed away as councillors. These are just some that are out here. So many more stories, but you guys know I'll be back. We'll tell more stories on another day. Keep an eye out. The next set of tours, we're wrapping up on September 11th. It's a Saturday, so it's not going to be an evening tour, but we are doing the one that we flubbed last time, the civil disobedience. We'll learn what Lethbridge does when they disobey rules. And we'll also be doing a walking tour of the Senator Buchanan neighborhood. Both of those will be on Saturday, September 11th. Again, if you want to come in person or if you want to go online, either way is wonderful. But Senator Buchanan has some awesome stories, and we'll get to learn a bit about him, but the neighborhood there between Stafford and 13th Street North, between the rail tracks and 9th Avenue. Lots of cool stories in that area, and we'll see you all in September.